Willkommen zum Q&A von Sound of Metal mit dem Regisseur Darius Marder. I'm very pleased to meet you. I'm very impressed by this movie and by the acting and by the sound, obviously. And I would just like to jump in and jump to the very beginning of this project. Maybe you could...
Oh, you don't want to do that. I'm telling you, that goes back.
That goes back, I heard.
That goes back further than you think.
Is it more than 8 years ago?
It is more than 8 years ago. Yeah. I mean, it depends what part of where it really depends where you start. And I'll just say very quickly that the project actually started with my dear friend Darius in France. He and I work together a lot. We wrote Place Beyond the Pines together, and we do a lot of writing together. And he actually was filming these real metal musicians, this band called Jucifer, back, starting maybe 12, 13 years ago. And he was making a kind of a hybrid documentary, meaning that it was involving narrative aspects, but he was shooting it like a doc. And I got really obsessed with this concept, and I got obsessed at the time with this idea of sound perspective. And I eventually, basically, I adopted that project from him, and I raised it as my own, which means I started over, but and wrote it obviously as a script. So it began that long ago, and went from there.
You actually in this little thing journalists get with the film. You even said something about the mother of your father, that it even started there.
Well, that's true. This is a really fascinating aspect of, the creative process, which is just what brings you to inspiration and how you start to understand that as you go sometimes. And my beloved grandmother was, first of all, a cinephile. She was one of the most learned, studied people in the world of film that I've ever met. And she was incredibly smart. She was she had a tough life. And, when she met my grandfather in the 50s, she said, I just have to tell you, I'm into women. And my grandfather said, well, so am I. And that seemed to work. But 30 years later, they got divorced, and she did end up with women, and she's a Jewish woman living in New York City, kind of finding her way. And then when she wasn't that old, in her early 70s, she went deaf. And she was stuck between two worlds. And she was a bit of a lost person anyway. And when I say lost, I mean, she had a hard life, and she was an orphan. And so by this time, she was stuck between two cultures, the hearing culture and the deaf culture. So I found that I ended up, both my brother and I, we wrote this together, Abraham, we used this as an inspiration, very interestingly, because we had this direct experience with someone really caught. And especially her. She was also an alcoholic, and she dealt with addiction. And I tell you, when you lose that connection to both the hearing and the deaf world, because you don't obviously know ASL, so you just can't communicate with anyone, And so, yeah, that was a big part of the inspiration.
Why did you not just write something about your grandmother?
Her story is worthy of being written in more ways than you know. And it's fascinating that she would arise through this. But one of the things about my grandmother, Dorothy, she was an amazing photographer, Dorothy Marder. You can look up her photographs. She worked pretty much in isolation for her whole life. And I don't want to go down this rabbit hole too much, because I know we don't have too much time. But the one thing I will say with Dorothy is that she was such a cinephile. And when she went deaf, she spent the rest of her life lobbying to get films captioned. Because at that time, no films were captioned. and closed captioning wasn't even a thing, but really she was lobbying to get films open captioned, which means that you could go to a theater, she loved film, and really watch these films, which obviously she was shut off from suddenly. So when I found myself making this film, I realized at one point, shit, I have to open caption this film. There's no way that I can portray deaf people on the screen and then tell them they are not welcome to see this movie. I have to do this. And I got a huge amount of pushback at first because this has literally never been done. I don't think a film's ever been open captioned. So I dedicated the film to Dorothy because that was really her life's work in many ways.
I must again say, fantastic acting, and as far as I know, you're more a writer and a documentary filmmaker. How did you achieve this beautiful acting, directing? You know, coaches, rehearsals.
I mean, I give the actors a lot of credit, of course. I mean, they did it. But actually, I was an actor myself, and I did begin in documentary. But I always had a narrative focus. And I have a very distinct feeling for process myself. And I mean, I think that it's incredibly important to me. The performance and acting moves me as I'm writing. I am always thinking about process as I'm writing. And so that's not a disconnect, you know, for me. But these actors are so phenomenal that, you know, and the thing is there's not one way to direct an actor. Every actor needs something slightly different. So it's really just about responding to the person that you see before you.
And I must say the casting is fantastic. We are now in Germany talking a lot about diversity. This kind of colorblind, I hate the word, but colorblind casting you did is excellent because you're not casting for hair color, but for really actor, you know, for the actor. And so this is phenomenal, actually. I hope it changes the industry, you know?
I really appreciate you saying that because it's so important, you know, and you know, this film is cast really for the best person for every role. The most inspiring, you know, version of this film is what you see on the screen. But there is a lot of diversity in this film. You know, the deaf community very rarely is seen on screen, and putting aside race or ethnicity, the deaf community is a culture unto themselves, and to see and feel the deaf community on screen is really inspiring to me. And it was a very hard fight to cast deaf people, and that might sound strange, and it sounds strange to me because why would you ever want to cast, you know, someone who wasn't part of deaf culture pretending to be a part of deaf culture? That's an anathema idea to me as well, but it was a hard fight.
And did you have any kind of teachers, coaches, drum teachers, musical teachers?
Oh yeah. Well, Riz, you know, he had never touched a drumstick before. And, you know, he came in, I was with him the first day that he picked up a drumstick, and Riz is like kind of next level, as most people know. He's a bit of a savant, and he expects to immediately, he thinks he's like Neo from the Matrix, where he just downloads something and then he knows how to do it. I know drums. But, you know, he was very surprised when he picked up a drumstick, and he was so frustrated. He's like, why can't I do this immediately? And, but the thing with drums is that it's a merging of right and left hemispheres in your brain, and there's just no rushing that. You have to take the time, you have to put in the work, and Riz did. He learned that from scratch. Everything you see on the screen is him playing, of course. You can't fake that. So, you know, he did that, I think, many months, drumming every single day with a phenomenal drum teacher in Brooklyn, Guy Licata, and they were quite a team.
So you apparently wrote I mean, you're like an author filmmaker, like the European way, and you also shot chronologically. Did that both help, or was it in the way sometimes?
Well, a couple things about the shooting process. I mean, it's shot on 35 millimeter, which means number one, rolling is precious. So you can't just roll and roll and roll the way we do with digital. And I think that is a profound thing to do on a set on its own. Shooting chronologically is probably the single best thing you can do for performance, because actors feel a sense of what came before and what's coming after. And we're so married to story and narrative that it deeply, changes your emotional experience as you're shooting. This film especially, though, because this film obviously is, we're plunged into an experience of deafness. So you have this kind of pre-deafness section and this during section, and then you have the last section of the film, and they're all distinct, and as you know, and so I didn't want to go back and forth. Once Riz was immersed within the deaf world of his own world, I didn't want him going back to a hearing world. And so, because he actually had implants that we put in his ears while he was performing. And that was specific. Those were made specifically for him so that they didn't just block sound. They actually emitted a white noise. And what that means is, and I actually had the controls on my iPhone, so I could be completely sadistic. And while he was performing, that noise, that white noise, could be turned up or down, or it could be turned into a piercing, ringing noise, which was important for certain sections. So what that means is he couldn't hear his own voice. And when you can't hear your own voice, you really lose control, a real sense of control. You don't know the volume. And that's what people go through when they lose their hearing. And so this process wasn't a process where you wanted to then take those out and go back to a hearing, talking world. Once we were in, we were in. And as the film went, that's how we operated.
That's fantastic. I want to dive a little bit into the sound, but in the editing. I mean, how much, because the sound is amazing, and I think for me this makes the sound makes it a really big movie. Also, it's strange to say, but
no, it isn't strange to say. I appreciate that.
How much of the sound quality of the different, because there are different kind of deafnesses and sound distortions and so on. How much of that did you discover? How much was envisioned by you? How much was scripted? Yeah.
Much of it was scripted, but that doesn't mean it wasn't a kind of a heuristic process once we got in it. So much of it was on the page, but we didn't quite know how to accomplish it. And because we were really doing something that we'd never heard before. And so actually, I spent a very long time, years in fact, trying to find the right sound person for this film. And I found I couldn't really sign on these kind of normal studios, sound studios, even though a lot of people were, this was interesting to sound people, of course. And it wasn't until I spoke to Nicolas Becker, who lives in Paris, that, he was introduced to me as this kind of interesting sound wizard guru guy. And he and I went on an odyssey that began a couple years before we started shooting. And we would do these sound camps and mic the inside of skulls and like underwater, and really testing the boundaries of sound and experience. And we ourselves would go into soundless chambers and feel what it felt like to be in a vacuum versus what it felt like to be, we even, conceived of a score that would operate around this instrument called the bachet, which is literally it's a French sculptural instrument that is all metal. And you're really hearing the reverberation of metal itself, not sound, not air, but the steel, the metal, the depth of the metal. And much of the score that you hear in this is that, because it's utterly, not only is it the sound of metal, literally, but it's utterly visceral in its experience. So it's never about, strings coming in or anything like that. It's utterly it's the vibration of the universe. So we began that. And then after and then Nicolas came to set. So during shooting, you'd see Nicolas like miking Riz's eyelids and in his throat. And we had condenser mics and contact surface mics on bodies, and we would have mics underwater while we were shooting. So we really did it while we were shooting. And then the post sound dive on this was as big or bigger than any action film, I can assure you. It's so many layers deep. I think we had a 22-week sound mix. It was an incredible odyssey, which we did at Carlos Regattas's studio in Mexico, which was an amazing experience. And just the sound team is amazing on this. Yeah.
Wow.
It's an odyssey. I mean, I could talk for hours just about the sound, but we were really trying to do something that we'd never felt in cinema, and that was just completely off the map. And it's certainly a deep and subtle language of sound in this film, for sure.
There's this French film philosopher Gilles Deleuze. He wrote a book about, he calls it the time image, and his theory is that when image and sound in a movie kind of fall apart, you experience like a philosophical notion of time.
Oh, that's fascinating. It's something we talk about.
And he talks about it. He talks about the like after the Second World War, European cinema, neorealism and Nouvelle Vague and so on. And I think you could easily be one of those time image filmmakers he mentions.
Lovely to say.
Yeah.
It's a wonderful thing you bring up, because sound and time have such a special relationship that you can't. Sound is time. Unlike an image, you can't freeze sound. Every moment of sound is, in fact, a moment of passing time, and that can never be stopped. And so that's very much reflected in the cutting of this film, which is like, and I have a lot of gratitude also toward my editor Mikkel for that, because what we did is we worked with this notion. Every cut in this film is a hard cut. There's no dissolves. There's no faking time. Everything is time. You never move back. You always move forward. But it's not a cut like a 3-frame dissolve or a 2-frame dissolve. Those cuts are as they are cuts. And I think the notion of that is that you feel that, and just on a sound level and a picture level, that this film really attempts to think about time a lot as it relates to sound. So that's a fascinating thing you bring up.
I think it's interesting. It's quite timely, because we're so satisfied with images that we like to hear podcasts. We also, the whole aspect of meditation and Zen and going into silence, it's a very timely thing. And I think it's interesting that the aspect of finding happiness in silence is somehow also portrayed in your film.
Absolutely. I mean, and of course we couldn't know that everyone would have been forced into their homes and away from everything that they're addicted to on the planet, and having to kind of go through this kind of monastic new life that everybody's living. And so in that sense, it really is timely and resonant. Of course, this notion is not anything new. Zen is so in right now. No, I mean, it's like this is an old idea. But I think on a global level, everybody is recognizing the degree to which we've been pushed to this place that Ruben experiences in this movie. I also grew up in a Gurdjieff community, actually, which was a spiritual community on a goat farm in Massachusetts, and this was all of our weekends were spent silently, and so I didn't think about this actually until well into the writing, but there's a lot in this film that comes from my direct experience growing up in a spiritual community. I do think it's a very spiritual movie. And even the piano piece that you hear in that is a piano piece written by Gurdjieff and de Hartmann and performed by probably the premier player of that music. So that's directly from my childhood experience.
Actually, usually you see in movies that the protagonist is very, like, fights for a cause or something he wants until the end. But this time, and that's, I felt is very, also maybe very timely, he achieves it by stepping back in a way, or just...
That's beautiful, yeah. One of the things that I was really interested in seeing if I could trigger in an audience is the indoctrination into the feeling of what you think you want versus what you actually need. And so there is this, red herring in a sense in this film of the fix, this bigger fix that isn't just the literal fix of drugs or anything like that, but the actual fix, this idea that we can, get this thing we think we want. And that's why this time is so interesting for all of us globally, because we're all having to look at that. We're all having to look at how we're all addicts and what do we actually need, or what do we actually want, and how often do we come to that? So you're right, there's that shifting of kind of focus in this movie. And I really appreciate you asking that question, because it means you really felt it.
What I also found interesting is just a little slight notion of shifting of atmosphere when you come to Europe. Okay, it's by sound, and it's also the language of the people that are speaking, but also like the whole movie has like a little shift in the end.
For people who are seeing this Q&A, I'm imagining it's after the movie, right? So
yeah, absolutely.
That's good, because I always am remiss to talk about things. But it is supposed to feel that way, and it's almost a short film at the end of the film. It's almost a film unto itself. It has a complete arc, and that's really achieved in a number of ways. There's a slightly different color palette. There's obviously a different sound palette. There's a completely different sound tapestry we're working with suddenly, and you're thrown into it, and a completely different cultural, tapestry, and I think that the feeling with this character, or the feeling we wanted in the end of this film, is this sense of like, this guy's, first of all, you don't see that coming. You probably don't think he's going to end up there. And the way that we're thrown into different cultures and different experiences, and they can feel so foreign to us, and yet there we are, and it's the same damn us. And, so in order to feel that sense of like returning to self, even in this foreign land, you have to feel that shift, just when you think you get used to the beginning of the film, that's over. And then you're getting used to the middle of the film, and that's a whole culture and feeling unto itself, and green and nature and this and that, and the deaf community. And then you're thrown into another one. But through all of these there's Ruben. And that's the thing that he has to come back to.
This being foreign comes like full circle in this moment. Yeah.
Absolutely, and that's how we talk a lot about that during the process with Ruben. He was always rudderless and without a home, and all constantly moving. And you even get that little bit of his history in the end, where you kind of get a sense of, oh, he was an army brat and moving from, so always moving and never at home. And, and yet that the last shot in the film is pretty much the same framing as the first shot. It's just the first one is surrounded by noise and darkness, and the last one he's surrounded by, silence and light.
Yeah. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it and your sensitive and thoughtful questions. Thanks a lot.
Maybe there's probably something I didn't ask you maybe wanted to tell, or?
Well, mainly I feel just grateful to my team and, that push to get this movie that was very hard to make out into the world, and my producers, Bert Hemelink and Sasha Ben Harosh and Bill and Kathy. And, I just feel very grateful for the team that's really made this happen. That's the main thing.